I warned them the lake was drying up. I begged them to let me refill it just a few inches of water legally approved on my own land. But the HOA president, Karen, said no. She blocked the inlet, called it unauthorized, and ordered contractors to seal my pump with concrete. Weeks later, the cracks started appearing. Not in my yard, in theirs. Foundations split, decks collapsed. Her luxury waterfront homes, they were the first to sink. And by the time the city got involved, it was too late. The drought had spoken louder than any HOA rulebook. This is the true story of how they tried to kill the lake and how I brought it back. I've always believed water remembers. The lake behind my home was more than just a body of water. It was the very reason I chose this place. After 25 years in federal service as a water systems engineer, most of them spent consulting for drought-stricken counties across the Southwest. I had no interest in suburban politics or HOA power plays. I only wanted stillness, a place where my hands could grow calloused from driving my own fence posts, where I could listen to loons at sunrise, and where I could feel quietly useful by tending the lake's old refill channel, an inlet that long ago used to keep the shoreline stable during dry seasons. The inlet sat on my land. A simple concrete culvert at the edge of my pasture, built in the 1960s by the original developers when this was still more farmland than subdivision. It connected the lake to an upstream reservoir. Nothing fancy, just a valve-reinforced piping and a set of shut-off gauges I maintained myself. The refill had been used only 3 times in the past decade, always during the hottest stretch of summer and always after I gave the HOA proper notice. But this year was different. By early June, the lake had already dropped nearly 2 feet. This was not ordinary evaporation. The region was suffering its 3rd consecutive dry year, and the nearby creeks were running shallow. I could see the strain on my own property, hairline cracks, spidering through the soil, the cottonwoods drooping with thirst. For the first time in years, a quiet unease settled in my chest. So I did what I had always done. I sent a letter, certified, date-stamped return receipt, requested exactly the way I had been trained. I informed the HOA that on June 15th, I intended to open the inlet for a controlled refill that would raise lake levels by 12 inches. I attached pressure charts, a current water quality report, and a signed approval from the city's Department of Water Management authorizing the temporary diversion. There was no reply. That silence should have been my first warning. On the morning of the 15th, I rose early, brewed a strong pot of coffee, and walked to the shed. The pump housing had aged, but I kept it meticulous. Hinges oiled, monthly diagnostics, run even a new backup battery installed the previous fall. I wheeled the manual valve open and set the gauges. A low whoosh sighed through the pipe, followed by the soft, steady music of moving water. The inlet was alive again. By noon, I could measure a slow but definite rise. Perhaps an inch, maybe slightly more. Enough to ease the pressure on the shoreline, to give the turtles back their muddy shelves, to blunt the harsh breath of June on the emerging algae. That was when I saw her. HOA President Karen Delancey stood on the opposite embankment in a crisp white pantsuit and oversized sunglasses, arms folded tight, mouth pinched like she'd been sucking on a lemon rind. "You didn't get approval for this," she called across the water. I stayed where I was. I notified the board, Karen, 30 days in advance. Certified mail. I have the signatures. She shook her head, pulled out her phone, and began snapping photographs as if documenting a crime scene. "You're flooding HOA common property. You'll be fined. Expect a cease and desist." Then she turned on her heel and marched away. At first, I laughed it off. I figured she would throw her usual tantrum, maybe rant in the neighborhood newsletter, and that would be the end of it. I had dealt with her kind before, the type who believed power came from barking the loudest. She ran the HOA like a petty kingdom, but I had never played that game. I wasn't on their email blasts. I didn't use the community pool. I had refused for years to pay the annual beautification fee for a flower bed that hadn't bloomed since the Clinton administration. My land, especially the lower parcel containing the inlet and pump shed, had been carved out by an old deed grandfathered in long before the HOA even existed. That land was mine. The inlet was mine. And the water, once it passed through my pipe, belonged to every soul whose backyard touched the lake, including Karen herself. So you can imagine my reaction the next morning when I walked out to check the gauges and found a neon orange notice stapled to my front gate. Unauthorized hydraulic activity. Subject to immediate fines and infractions. HOA case, number 511. Beneath the bold type, a single signature, K. Delancey. There was no mistaking the handwriting. I shook my head, tore the notice down, and walked to the water's edge. The inlet was still running. The water was clean, the level rising slowly and safely. Everything was working exactly as it was designed to work. But something cold twisted in my gut, because I knew Karen, and Karen did not bluff. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything: photographs, time-lapse video, a handwritten log of every gauge reading. I sent a second letter to the city, made backup copies of the original inlet blueprints, and scanned the Department of Water Management's approval letter a second time. Then I waited, because water remembers, and so do I. The next morning, I woke before dawn, not to an alarm or habit, but to a thin wire of tension pulled taut inside my ribs. A light rain had fallen overnight, not enough to register on any gauge, just enough to bead the grass and leave a faint silver film across the roof of the pump shed. I brewed coffee, pulled on the same boots I'd worn the night before, and stepped outside while the sky was still the color of wet slate. The lake already looked healthier. I stood at the edge with my arms crossed, sipping slowly. In 48 hours, the refill had lifted the water 3 inches. Nothing dramatic, but enough to hide the worst of the exposed roots and soften the sagging mudbanks. Then I heard the low growl of tires on gravel. A white HOA utility truck rolled to the end of my driveway and stopped. 2 men climbed out, one carrying a clipboard, the other a 5-gallon bucket wrapped in hazard yellow tape. They didn't glance at me. They walked straight past my fence and down the path toward the pump shed like they owned the place. "Hey," I called, voice still rough with sleep. "You're on private property." Clipboard guy didn't break stride. He stopped at the control box and started taking pictures with his phone. The second man knelt by the main shutoff valve, pulled a laminated sign from the bucket, and began zip-tying it to my chain-link fence. Notice of operations halt. HOA Directive 117B. Unauthorized pumpings. Something snapped loose inside me. I strode down the hill fast enough that gravel scattered under my boots. "Who authorized this?" I demanded. HOA President Clipboard Guy muttered without looking up. "Karen Delancey. This falls under her jurisdiction." "No, it does not," I said, voice flat and hard. "This inlet predates the HOA by decades. It's on my deed. The city approved my operation. You have zero authority here." "You'll have to take that up with the board," he answered, eyes still on his phone. Then they simply walked away. No badge flashed, no warrant, shown no further word. They left the orange sign flapping in the morning breeze like a victory flag. I ripped it down the instant their truck disappeared, but I did not shut the pump off, not yet. Instead, I marched straight to my office, woke my desktop, and opened email. At the top of the inbox sat a message stamped, "Urgent," from HOA Legal Affairs. I clicked. A 4-page scanned letter on official letterhead waited for me, dated that same morning. It was thick with legalese, escalating fines, potential property liens, and possible court action for continued operation of a non-sanctioned hydraulic system. They actually used the phrase non-sanctioned hydraulic system, as if my 60-year-old culvert were a covert missile silo. Karen had moved overnight. She had reclassified the inlet as a major water disturbance source and rammed an emergency board resolution through before sunrise, declaring it prohibited infrastructure. The irony tasted metallic. That same infrastructure had saved the lake 3 times in the past 15 years, including once in 2012, when wildfire came within 3 miles and the higher water level kept flames from leaping through the bone-dry reeds. Back then, the sitting HOA president had shaken my hand and thanked me in front of the entire community. Now, they called it sabotage. I opened the HOA bylaws. I'd kept a dog-eared copy for years, mostly for amusement, and there it was. Section 9.4. No member shall modify or manipulate natural or artificial waterways, affecting shared visual easements, or regulated drainage zones without express board approval. A flimsy rule meant to stop someone from digging a backyard koi pond, not to override city-permitted pre-existing infrastructure. But Karen didn't need to be right. She only needed to sound official enough to intimidate. And judging by the sudden flood of neighbor emails already piling up, it was working. "Hey, saw the signs on your inlet. Are we in danger? Karen says your pump is breaking state law. Is that true? Wait, I thought you were the guy who fixed the lake back in 2017. One message from my next-door neighbor Claire cut deeper than the rest. "I'm not trying to pick sides, but Karen said you're pulling water from a protected source. If the city investigates, won't that hurt all of us?" Just think about it, okay? That "just think about it" stung worse than any fine. Claire had lived beside me for 12 years. I'd repaired her fence after the 2019 windstorm. I'd fed her cat Mr. Whiskers when she went to visit her daughter in Denver. And now she doubted me because Karen had poured poison into the HOA grapevine. I stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box, then closed the laptop without typing a word. Arguing by email was pointless. Instead, I opened the old steel filing cabinet and pulled out 2 thick manila folders: Inlet Deed History and City Water Correspondence. These weren't just papers, they were receipts. I scanned every page, date-stamped the PDFs, added digital watermarks, and compiled a single airtight response. Original 1973 engineering maps. 1986 easement acknowledgement. The 2021 approval letter from the city's Environmental Hydrology Department. Everything. Then I drove straight to City Hall. I didn't bother with the HOA office or Karen's kangaroo court. I walked up to the 3rd floor of Public Works and straight into the office of Renee Travis, the same supervisor who had signed my refill request. Renee looked up from her desk and smiled. "Something wrong with the inlet." I dropped the fat folder in front of her. "Karen Delancey just declared it illegal." She blinked. "Come again?" For the next half hour, I laid it all out: the truck, the sign, the threatening letter, the overnight emergency resolution. Renee flipped pages in silence, occasionally raising an eyebrow. Then she pulled up the city's infrastructure portal on her computer and typed. "Yep," she said, turning the monitor so I could see. "Inlet is active, registered, and approved for limited emergency use under municipal oversight. It's literally in the system." "Can I get that in writing?" I asked. She was already hitting print. 6 copies, city seal, today's date, her signature in blue ink. I walked out of City Hall with ammunition. Karen had started a war. Now I was armed. I don't know if I slept that night. If I did, it was the shallow, restless kind where the mind keeps running laps long after the body has given up. I had the city's official letter folded in my shirt pocket like a loaded round, but Karen didn't fight with facts. She fought with speed and noise, and she knew most people would fold before they ever checked the fine print. At 5:38 a.m., I woke to the sound of metal on concrete, irregular, deliberate, wrong. I threw on jeans, grabbed a flashlight, and jogged barefoot down the path. The sky was the color of tarnished nickel. In that half-light, I saw them 3 men in reflective vests, one running a small excavator, the other 2 crouched at the intake pipe with bags of quick-set concrete and a mixing trough already half full. My stomach dropped straight through the earth. "Hey," I shouted, voice cracking across the stillness. "This is private property. You do not have permission to be here." The youngest one looked up, trowel in his gloved hand. "We've got an emergency work order from the HOA. Risk of infrastructure breach." I was already closing the distance. "That pipe is city permitted. You tamper with it, you're committing a state-level offense." He hesitated. The excavator engine died with a cough. "You got paperwork?" he asked. I pulled the city's letter from my pocket. I'd slept with it on the nightstand like a pistol and handed it over. He read it under the beam of my flashlight brow, creasing deeper with every line. "This is real," he muttered. "Department of Water Management seal and everything." "Exactly," I said. "And you're about 10 seconds from me calling the sheriff for criminal trespass." He glanced at the others. "They told us this was HOA common ground." "It's not. This inlet and the 2 acres around it were deeded outside HOA jurisdiction in 1974. Pack up." He nodded slowly, handed the letter back. "We're just the subs, man. No trouble." They started loading tools. By the time the excavator clanked onto the trailer and the taillights disappeared, my heart was still hammering against my ribs. They'd managed to pry open the intake panel housing. A skin of wet concrete already glistened in the prep bin. 10 more minutes, and the pipe would have been entombed forever. I checked the gauges. Flow had dropped to a trickle. Someone had throttled the upstream gate, or debris had jammed the line when they started prying. Either way, pressure was bleeding. I called Renee the moment City Hall opened. She answered on the second ring. They tried to pour concrete into the intake, I said without greeting. What? Her voice went sharp. Who? Karen sent contractors before sunrise. Claimed emergency authority. I stopped them, but the system's compromised. I need a stop work order, and I need the city to put the HOA on formal notice, publicly. I'm drafting it right now, she said. Certified notarized, delivered today. And I'm copying the county sheriff. This just crossed from petty into criminal. Thank you, Renee. That afternoon, I walked the shoreline to clear my head. The lake shimmered under a merciless sun. The refill had given us 4 inches total, but now the rise had stalled. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, watching me like it already knew the ending. Old Mr. Kellerman tipped his fishing hat as I passed. Heard commotion this morning. HOA tried to bury the pipe in concrete, I said. He whistled low. Karen's got claws. She's got a problem with reality. He chuckled. Keep pushing, son. That lake never looked better than when you're looking after it. His words stayed with me, but they also reminded me Karen didn't care about the lake. She cared about control. When I got home, a new email waited 6 pages from the HOA subject line. Formal violation notice, non-compliance, escalation. They claimed I had ignored multiple cease and desist notices. They accused me of unauthorized hydraulic modifications, creating liability risk to adjacent property owners. They threatened $1,500 daily fines until the pump was disabled, and an HOA-approved environmental consultant performed a full inspection. Bureaucratic fanfiction. Half the citations were misquoted, the other half misapplied. But I recognized the game built a paper trail thick enough to intimidate, or if needed to drag into small claims court. Karen was betting I would blink. She didn't know I'd spent years in war zones where the stakes were measured in human lives, not patio cracks. I opened a new folder on my desktop. HOA hostility, July. I saved every email, every photo, every time-stamped video. I printed hard copies, 3-hole punched them, slid them into binders. I started a running log date time event witnesses. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. That evening, I drove to the upstream reservoir with the old set of city keys I still carried from my consulting days. I had no intention of touching anything. I just needed to see. The gate valve was closed tight. Fresh wrench marks scarred the wheel. Not city crews. Someone who didn't have legal access had done it anyway. I stood there staring at my own reflection warped in the steel and felt something ancient and cold settle in my bones. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She was starving the lake. And when people play God with water, there is always a reckoning. She simply hadn't realized that nature had already begun keeping score. By the end of the first week, the lake had stopped rising. The sabotage had worked. With the upstream valve manually locked, no new water could reach my inlet. The gauges flatlined, and by day 9 they began ticking backward. The retreat was slow at first, a quiet, almost polite withdrawal, like the lake was trying not to disturb anyone. Then the muddy crescents appeared where grass had once met water. Docks that had floated proudly all spring now rested on cracked clay. One neighbor's blue paddle boat sat marooned in the middle of what looked like a dried-up moon crater. Week 2 brought the first public complaints. Diane from Lot, one of Karen's most loyal orbiters, posted a dramatic photo on the HOA Facebook page, her once lush backyard sloping down to a shrinking algae green puddle. Caption: If this environmental activist next door thinks starving the lake helps nature, someone needs to wake him up. The comments exploded. Some defended me. Most just wanted their view back. Then came the town hall meeting. I hadn't planned to go Wednesday at 2:00 p.m. is designed to keep working people away, but my name was item 4 on the printed agenda in bold. So I walked into the community center wearing a collared shirt and boots, still caked with the red mud I'd been scraping off the lower drainage berm. The room smelled of burnt coffee and barely contained panic. Karen stood at the podium in a pastel pink blazer flanked by 2 board members and a stack of color-printed bar graphs. She opened with theatrical sorrow. As many of you have noticed, our lakefront community is experiencing an unprecedented and rapid drop in water level. This affects aesthetics, property values, and ecological health. Regrettably, it is the direct result of unsanctioned water manipulation by one resident who chose to act without board approval. She never said my name, but every head swiveled toward me. I stood. That's a lie. Karen's smile thinned. Mr. Bell, you'll have your turn. I was already walking forward, manila envelope in hand. This is a certified statement from the City Department of Water Management, confirming that my inlet is legal permitted and was operating exactly as authorized. The only reason the lake is dropping is because someone without authority closed the upstream reservoir gate. I have dated photos of fresh wrench marks and city access logs proving no municipal crew touched it. A ripple of gasps moved through the room. Karen tilted her head like a schoolmarm scolding a child. Are you suggesting sabotage, Mr. Bell? I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it. Greg Hallman, quiet retiree, rarely spoke unless the building was literally on fire, rose in the back row. Wait a minute. I thought that inlet was grandfathered in. Didn't your family install it back in the 60s? My father helped pour the concrete in 1969, I said. I've maintained it ever since. Karen cut in, voice sharp as broken glass. That may be true, but this is no longer the 1960s. We have covenants. We have standards. We must act with unity and decorum. Decorum, I repeated, stepping closer to the podium. Is that why you sent men with an excavator and quick-set concrete to my property before sunrise? Because sealing a city-permitted pipe in secret felt decorous to you. Dead silence. Then Claire, my neighbor of 12 years, the one who had doubted me, spoke softly from the third row. Karen, did you really try to bury his pipe? Karen's cheeks flushed crimson. I executed an emergency resolution under Section 3.6 of Board Authority. Section 3.6 only applies to imminent flooding, I said. There was no flood, just fear. Manufactured fear. The room erupted. People stood. Voices overlapped. Some demanded answers, others just wanted their docks to float again. For the first time, the anger wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at the waterline itself and at the woman who had promised to protect it. That weekend, the fish kills started small sunfish, floating silver-bellied in the shallows, oxygen-starved. Turtles vanished. A muskrat washed up near the inlet mouth, tongue swollen purple from toxic algae. By July 4th, the lake smelled like a swamp, left in the sun. The fireworks barge couldn't launch. There was nothing but mud to anchor it. The show was canceled due to environmental conditions, but everyone knew the truth. Neighbors who once waved now shouted across fences. Board members' inboxes filled with rage. Even Diane from Lot 19 filed a complaint when clouds of gnats rose from the marsh that used to be her garden. Karen's response doubled down. A mass email went out claiming I was withholding critical hydrological access and potentially endangering the entire biome. She floated the idea of a class action lawsuit against me for creating artificial drought conditions. It would have been comical if it weren't so terrifying. In HOA land, perception is policy. I was no longer just a nuisance. I was the villain in Karen's story, the rogue homeowner who had murdered their lake. So I fought the only way I knew how. I mailed packets to the local TV station, the County Environmental Board, and the State Water Engineers Association, where I had once keynoted their annual conference. I didn't need to scream louder than Karen. I just needed the truth to outlive her lies. Because the water line was still dropping, and the tension in this neighborhood was rising faster than any refill ever could. After the town hall meeting, the air in the neighborhood changed, not because Karen backed down. She only grew louder, more brittle, more furious that her grip was slipping, but because people finally started looking at me instead of past me. Neighbors who used to hurry inside when I walked by now offered small nods. A few knocked quietly after dark with questions they were afraid to ask in daylight. Claire left a foil-covered plate of still-warm blueberry muffins on my porch with a note in her careful handwriting. I'm sorry I doubted you. I didn't know the whole story. Thank you for not giving up on the lake. Or on us. Of course she didn't know. None of them did. I had never told anyone why I moved here 12 years ago, what I had done before, or what I had walked away from. It wasn't shame. It was self-preservation. After enough years in disaster response, you learn that silence is sometimes the only way to stay whole. But the past surfaces when the ground beneath the present starts to crack. So I opened the old footlocker in the garage, the one I hadn't touched since the day I turned in my retirement papers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Inside lay three things. My battered deployment helmet from Afghanistan, still carrying the long scrape from a convoy rollover outside Kandahar. A field notebook thick with hand-drawn hydrology sketches and raw lakebed data from the Rio Grande Restoration Project after the 2006 floods. A single red USB drive labeled in faded Sharpie, Texas. Flash flood, Forest. I plugged it in. The files opened like Ghost's drone orthomosaics soil stress models, time-stamped photos of subdivisions built on fill dirt that liquefied the first time it rained hard. 9 people died in that event. I was the lead investigator. I testified in federal court. I helped rewrite half the drainage codes still used across the western states. That was the man Karen thought she was bullying a quiet retiree with a shed and a pump. She had no idea she was poking someone who once stood in FEMA tents, explaining to widows why their houses were gone. I printed the real resume, not the polite one-page version project's testimonies, peer-reviewed papers. I highlighted the 2010 article I co-authored on shrink-swell clay behavior during prolonged drought and its effect on shallow foundations, exactly what was now happening under every premium waterfront home along the West Bank. Then I mailed an unmarked manila envelope to every board member, no return address. Next, I called an old colleague, Luis Ortega, now regional director at the State Geological Survey. I laid out the timeline, the blocked inlet, the dropping lake, the soil movement I was already measuring. Luis listened without interrupting, then said the words that turned my blood to ice water. If those slabs were poured without proper deep anchoring, and you're seeing that much desiccation, you're looking at differential settlement. Houses start cracking in months, not years. I'm already seeing cracks, I told him. He exhaled slowly. Document everything. Date, time, location photos with a ruler for scale. If this goes south, they'll try to blame you. But if you can prove the damage began while the lake was being deliberately starved, you own the narrative. That night, I walked the shoreline with a surveyor's level staff and a digital inclinometer. I took readings at 5 fixed points along the HOA-owned West Bank, the cul-de-sac of million-dollar homes that curved like a jeweled necklace around the prettiest part of the lake. I recorded micro-fissures in retaining walls' slope changes, and one measurement that stopped me cold, a private dock that had shifted almost 5 inches laterally in 21 days. This was no longer cosmetic. This was the earth rearranging itself 1 silent millimeter at a time. The drought was the weapon. Karen's blockade had simply pulled the trigger. I started a new routine. Every sunrise, I photographed the lake from the exact same 3 spots. I placed reference markers, painted rocks, surveyor stakes, even a child's abandoned toy boat frozen in the mud, so shrinkage would be undeniable. I ran soil moisture probes twice daily and graphed the collapse. Then the heat wave arrived, a brutal, breathless dome that parked itself over the county and refused to leave. Daytime highs topped 105 degrees for 12 straight days. Nights never cooled below 82. Lawns surrendered to straw. Tree leaves curled like clenched fists. The lake fell faster than any model had predicted, and that was when the first foundation cracks appeared in the houses. An anonymous post on the neighborhood forum, a close-up of a jagged diagonal fracture running from a window corner to the foundation seam. Caption: anyone else seeing this? Then another photo, then 5 more. The third image was unmistakable Lot 34. Karen's own house, her pride and joy, with the imported travertine patio and the panoramic glass walls. She never posted it herself, of course. But I knew that crack. I had written entire reports about cracks exactly like it. It was a classic shear failure, the kind that starts small and ends with a house sliding off its own foundation. I stood at the water's edge the next morning and watched the herons wheel overhead in slow, patient circles. I did not feel triumph. I felt only the heavy certainty of what was coming next. Karen had blocked the inlet. She could not block physics. Water remembers. Soil remembers. And very soon, everyone was going to learn what I had known for months. When you steal balance from the land takes it back piece by expensive piece. By the middle of July, the lake had surrendered 18 inches of depth since spring. 18 inches sounds harmless until you understand that on a shallow prairie lake, it means thousands of tons of water vanished into the sky, and the clay beneath began to shrink like a sponge left in the sun. The lake bed looked lunar-wide, plates of cracked clay lightning bolt fissures, dead reeds standing like burnt matches. The air above the water shimmered with heat and carried the sour stink of anaerobic decay. The HOA still pretended everything was normal. Karen's weekly newsletter spoke of seasonal fluctuation and temporary aesthetic challenges, while foam the color of antifreeze collected in the corners and ducks abandoned us for wetter pastures. I tried one last time to reason with them. I requested a special board meeting, not to fight, simply to present data. I arrived with color graphs, historic lake levels overlaid on this year's collapsed satellite thermal images showing the heat island, the dry lake bed, had become soil saturation curves that predicted structural failure within weeks. I even brought a guest letter from Luis Ortega at the State Geological Survey corroborating every number. Karen cut me off before I finished the first slide. "I believe we've had quite enough scare tactics, Mr. Bell," she said with a thin, amused smile. "This is a homeowners association, not a graduate seminar." "It's not a scare tactic," I answered, keeping my voice low. "It's a warning. Your last one." Harold from the board shifted in his seat like he wanted to speak, but one icy glance from Karen pinned him silent. I left knowing I had wasted my breath. The real audience was never in that room. The real audience was every family watching their lawn turn to powder. Their retaining walls split, their $1 million investment literally cracking under their feet. So I changed tactics. At 4:30 a.m., I printed 100 flyers, simple white paper, black ink, no drama. 3 graphs, 2 soil reports, before and after photos of the lake. At the bottom, in bold 18-point type, "The lake cannot heal itself. Refilling is not optional. Continued inaction equals structural failure." I slid them under doors while the streets were still asleep, pinned them to every bulletin board, handed them to early dog walkers who passed my fence. I didn't preach. I just gave them the pictures and the numbers and let the truth do the rest. It worked. People began stopping me on the walking path. They showed me phone photos of spiderweb cracks across garage floors' doors that no longer latched plumbing lines that had snapped from ground shift. Ted from Lot 22 handed me a $4,800 invoice for a burst sewer lateral contractor's note soil movement consistent with extreme desiccation. Karen's counterattack was predictable. The next newsletter carried a full-page section titled Disinformation Campaign Alert. She claimed my charts were doctored, accused me of misusing city seals, hinted I might be in violation of federal water statutes. It was almost comical, until I remembered that people's homes were literally tearing themselves apart. Then just after 11 p.m. one night, someone knocked. I opened the door to Harold from the board, sweating through his polo shirt, clutching a yellow envelope like it burned his hand. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing up and down the dark street. "But you need to see this." Inside were printed emails, internal board chain, time-stamped 3 days earlier. Karen instructing the board to suppress all public discussion of foundation damage. One highlighted line stopped my heart. "Let him keep shouting into the wind. Once the land settles, the panic will pass, and property values will stabilize." The land was not settling. It was heaving. A structural engineer, hired privately by the Bradleys on Lot 35, had already flagged 6 houses for movement. One slab had dropped 1.5 inches on the lakeside, enough to turn a house into 2 expensive halves. Still, Karen stonewalled every attempt to call an emergency vote. She even floated a motion to install a decorative water feature rock garden in the middle of the dry lake bed code for "Let's pretend the lake never existed." I wrote one final letter, this one addressed to every single homeowner. I told them everything: the inlet's legal history, the city approvals, the upstream tampering, the soil forecasts. I attached photos of the cracks now crawling up Karen's own walls. I ended with a section titled "What Happens Next" that laid out repair costs in cold, ugly numbers. 70 copies, delivered by hand. Some people read it on their front porches and looked up at me with tears in their eyes. Then nature ended the debate for us. It began with a sound, a deep subterranean groan that rolled through the ground just after midnight. I felt it in my teeth before I heard it. By morning, 3 houses reported garage walls pulling away from the main structure. One front porch step had cracked clean in 2. A sunroom door on Lot 37 now hung an inch proud of its frame, daylight showing through the gap. The earth had declared war. I stood at the shoreline that evening and watched the last light bleed out of the sky over a lake that looked more like a cracked desert than water. I whispered to no one, "I warned you." The wind didn't answer. It only carried the smell of dust and coming ruin. The cement truck arrived on a Tuesday in early August, its low rumble cutting through a morning so still the cicada's drone hung like a warning over the lake bed. I stood at my fence, coffee cooling in my hand, and watched it roll down lakeside carts with a trailer hitched to the back. The orange lettering on the side read, Baines Foundation Repair. It stopped in front of Lot 34. Karen's house. No newsletter announced it. No HOA bulletin. But the signs were unmistakable. Her foundation was failing. From my side of the lake, I could see the workers move with grim efficiency, lugging rebar drilling into parched soil, scanning the ground with radar units, like surgeons probing a dying organ. Hydraulic jacks stood ready. A pile driver squatted on a flatbed. This wasn't a patch job. This was a last-ditch attempt to stabilize a house that was sinking into itself. I walked the perimeter later that day, not to gloat, just to measure. Every home along the West Bank, lots 31 through 38, bore wounds, window frames torqued slightly outward, gutters drooping like tired eyelids, soil gaps yawning where patios once sat flush. On Lot 36, a for sale sign had sprouted overnight. Reduced price, it screamed in red. Date posted 3 days ago. It wouldn't sell, not with the ground groaning beneath it. Karen stayed silent. No public statement, no newsletter, mea culpa. Even at the emergency board meeting, forced by a homeowner quorum invoking Article 7.3. Community-driven motion for board review in event of environmental hazard. She sat diminished, her pink blazer swapped for a plain navy windbreaker. No sunglasses, no prepared speech, just a woman shrinking under the weight of her own consequences. The meeting room was packed, folding chairs along the walls. Residents standing shoulder to shoulder, clutching photos of cracked foundations and invoices for 5-figure repairs. The air buzzed with a new emotion, not skepticism, but urgency. I stepped to the front and laid out the data one last time: flow logs, soil reports, city permits, timelines, proving the damage began before the refill. I ended with a single question, voice steady. How much more has to break before you let the water return? A man in the back clapped, then another. Soon the room thundered with applause, not for me, but for the truth, raw and undeniable. The drought wasn't a theory anymore. It was here, eating their homes from below. Harold took the microphone. I motion we immediately reinstate water access through the Bell Inlet and request city aid for soil stabilization. Seconded, a woman near the front called. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Her jaw tightened as she stared straight ahead. The vote passed, unanimously. 2 days later, a city letter arrived authorizing me to reopen the inlet with a reduced flow limit to conserve the reservoir, but enough to begin healing. I walked to the shed alone that evening, the sky bruised purple with dusk. The pump sat silent, cloaked in dust and cobwebs from weeks of neglect. I wiped the gauges clean, opened the service hatch, and pressed the start button. It growled to life like a loyal dog waking from a long sleep. Water flowed with a metallic sigh. I stood there for 20 minutes, listening not to the pump, but to the shoreline, to the soil drinking its first slow sips, to the herons returning their wings, cutting silent arcs above, to the stillness from the West Bank where cracked houses stood humbled. A week later, the workers returned to Karen's property, this time with a jackhammer. They tore out half her patio, demolished her retaining wall, dug trenches for new footings. Her dock, once the gleaming heart of her premium waterfront lifestyle, now sagged, warped, and abandoned, tilting like a derelict ship on the muddy shore. Karen never spoke to me again, not at the mailbox, not on the walking path, not even when I testified at the county hearing on HOA accountability and water access rights. But I heard what she told others. She hadn't been fully informed. The board miscommunicated. In hindsight, mistakes were made. She never said I was wrong. She didn't need to. The lake said it for her. Within 3 weeks of the refill, the sour smell faded. Algae retreated. Small fish flickered in the shallows again. The earth, slow to forgive, began to steady. Not every crack could be undone. Some damage was permanent. But some damage carried a lesson. It taught them. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Early September brought the first real hint of mercy cooler nights, lower evaporation, and the steady, patient pulse of the inlet doing its quiet work. The water line had climbed almost 10 inches since the day I turned the valve again. Green returned in hesitant patches along the edges. Frogs started singing at dusk. Dragonflies stitched silver threads above the reeds. The lake wasn't whole yet, but it was breathing again, and so was the neighborhood. Karen, however, was not ready to exhale. She had gone quiet for a few weeks, like a wounded animal licking its wounds behind manicured hedges. Her patio remained a construction zone. Rumor put her repair bill north of $64,000, though she refused the HOA's offer of a reimbursement audit. Most of us assumed pride would force her into a slow, silent retreat. We were wrong. The quarterly HOA meeting was moved to the elementary school gymnasium because the community center was too small for the crowd that now showed up. I arrived late, having just emailed my final soil recovery report to the city hydrology office. The room was already humming when I slipped in the side door. Karen stood at the podium in a charcoal blazer 2 sizes too stiff microphone clutched like a weapon. And while I commend the efforts some residents have made, she said, voice polished, but vibrating with old venom, it is imperative we address the unregulated, unsupervised nature of the recent lake refill conducted by one individual without consistent board oversight. Several homeowners have expressed legitimate concerns about erosion shifting water levels and long-term structural risk stemming from. I raised my hand from the back row. Point of order. She faltered for half a second. You'll have your turn, Mr. Bell. I believe I'm due it now, I said, walking down the aisle. Every seat was taken. People parted like water. At the podium, I set down a thick folder. Inside are the complete inlet usage logs for the past 60 days. Flow rates, pH turbidity, all monitored daily, and countersigned by the City of Redacted Water Management Department. You want oversight. It's here in triplicate more rigorous than anything this HOA has required in 20 years. Karen opened her mouth. I lifted one finger. Also included sworn affidavits from 3 licensed engineers. One of them, the regional director of the State Geological Survey, confirming that the foundation damage on the West Bank began no fewer than 21 days before the refill resumed. The cause was soil desiccation triggered by deliberate interference with a permitted water system. Her face went the color of old ash. And finally, I said, voice low enough that the whole gym leaned in. I don't give a damn about your ego anymore, Karen. But I do care about the people in this room who trusted you to protect their homes and watched you gamble with their foundations to save face. You didn't just fail them. You blamed me for the fallout of your own pride. Silence so complete I could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Then Mrs. Redford, quiet widow from Lot, of 81 years young, stood up, adjusted her glasses, and spoke in a voice clear as a church bell. I moved for formal censure of President Delancey. Karen's head snapped toward her. We were lied to, Mrs. Redford continued. We were endangered. That is not leadership. That is malpractice. Seconded came 3 voices at once. The vote was held right there on the gym floor. Bylaws required 2/3 for censure. We hit 92%. It did not remove her from office, but it stripped her of unilateral authority. From that night forward, every decision involving water drainage, soil, or budget required full board vote and public posting 48 hours in advance. Her claws were clipped. She left the building without a word, heels striking tile like the last nails in her own coffin. Outside people didn't cheer. They simply came up to me one by one, a nod, a handshake, a quiet thank you, a hand on the shoulder. Claire was last. She tried to turn us all against you, she said, eyes red-rimmed. Some of us listened. I'm so sorry. I squeezed her arm. You're here now. That's enough. Later, under a thin September moon, I walked to the water's edge. The inlet hummed its steady song behind me. The surface mirrored a sky full of stars, unbroken for the first time in months. I sat on the old bench beneath the cottonwood and let the weight slide off my shoulders like a rucksack I'd carried too long. Karen had tried to win with fear, with spectacle, with blame. But truth has its own rhythm, and like the lake, it always finds its level. I thought the censure would be the end of it. Bureaucracy usually limps away bleeding after a public humiliation, and most people assumed Karen would finish her term in sullen obscurity, then vanish into whatever real estate seminar circuit still welcomed her. I underestimated 2 things. How thoroughly I had documented everything. 2. How much the city hates being dragged into someone else's war. 2 weeks after the gymnasium vote, an email arrived from the City Office of Environmental Compliance. Subject: Notification of Review, Lakeside HOA. Unpermitted modifications and negligence allegations. I stared at the screen so long the words blurred. It wasn't a polite inquiry. It was a case file complete with a 6-digit tracking number and a list of municipal codes I knew by heart. 1204.7. Interference with permitted water infrastructure. 14.2.1. Negligent risk to shared ecosystem. 9.3.9 Unauthorized alteration of private civil works. They had opened a formal investigation based on the packets I had quietly fed them since June. Within days, neighbors started forwarding me their own letters. The city was requesting statements, repair invoices, and any correspondence with the HOA regarding foundation settlement or lake level management. The Bradleys from Lot 35 attached a voice memo they had recorded in July Karen on speakerphone crystal clear. If we reopen that pipe, we lose control. The lake will fluctuate and everyone will blame us for whatever goes wrong. Better to let it ride out. That single sentence turned the tide from investigation to inevitability. Early October brought the site visit. 4 city vehicles rolled in at 7:00 a.m. Sharp Renee Travis, a senior hydrologist, a geotechnical engineer, and a compliance officer whose mirrored sunglasses reflected the cracked lakebed-like judgment itself. We started at the inlet. I walked them through every gauge, every logbook, every time-stamped photo of the attempted concrete burial. Then we followed the shoreline west. I pointed out the fissures I had measured since July, the shifted docks, the retaining walls now leaning like drunks. At Lot 34 we stopped. Karen's house stood half-gutted patio, gone new helical piers, driven deep into the clay like steel roots, temporary shoring beams, holding the west wall in place. She wasn't home or chose not to appear. The compliance officer took one long look, whistled low, and snapped 37 photos. When we finished, Renee turned to me in the street. You said someone closed the upstream gate on HOA orders. I said someone did it after Karen passed an emergency motion, I corrected. I have a transcribed voicemail from the subcontractor she paid in cash. It's in the envelope I handed you. She took it without a word. 2 weeks later, the notice of noncompliance was posted on every community bulletin board and emailed to every homeowner. $22,000 in fines. Mandatory quarterly oversight by the city for 2 full years. Every future decision involving water drainage or soil required pre-approval from Public Works. Karen resigned 48 hours after the notice went public. Her email was 2 sentences long. Due to medical reasons and an unsustainable level of harassment from certain residents, I am stepping down effective immediately. No one replied. No one needed to. A special election was called. Claire nominated me for president. I laughed and declined. I didn't save the lake to run the HOA, I told her. I just wanted the water back. The city offered me a different title instead. Community Environmental Liaison, unpaid, but with full access to records inspection rights and a direct line to Renee's office. I accepted. Peace for the first time in months felt real. Nature doesn't negotiate with policy. Water once denied returns with memory. And truth, no matter how long it is buried, eventually rises like the lake itself, slow, steady, and impossible to silence. On the last morning of October, I opened the inlet for the final controlled refill of the season. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the first real bite of coming winter. The cottonwoods along the east bank had turned the color of fire and were dropping their leaves in slow spirals that floated on the rising water like tiny red boats with no destination. I knelt beside the culvert and ran my hand over the steel housing. It was warm from the sun, humming softly under my palm. The gauges read full clearance. The upstream gate stood wide open, city seal still bright on the lock. No more barricades, no more orange notices, just the quiet, faithful rush of water returning home. I turned the wheel all the way. The flow answered instantly, a deep, steady surge that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. For the first time in months, I let myself feel it fully. The tears came without warning, sliding hot down cold cheeks, not from anger or exhaustion, but from the simple, overwhelming gratitude of a job finished. Behind me, footsteps on gravel. Claire approached in a thick cardigan, hands buried in the pockets, eyes squinting against the low sun. She stood beside me without speaking for a long time, watching the water spread. How long until it's really back, she asked finally. 2 weeks to normal winter levels, I said. The rest will take seasons, but it's alive again. She nodded toward the west bank, where new benches had appeared and fresh shoreline grass was already sprouting. And us. Longer, I smiled, but possible. Water heals, so does time. She laughed softly. The new board wants to give you a title, Water Steward, Lake Guardian, something dramatic. Sounds like a fairy tale character. You kind of are. I shook my head. I don't need a title, Claire. I just needed the lake to live. She studied me for a moment, then rested her hand on my shoulder. You gave us more than the lake. In the weeks that followed, the water kept rising. Algae vanished first, then the smell. With cooler nights and restored circulation, oxygen levels climbed. Bass fingerlings darted in the shallows again. Turtles hauled out onto half-submerged logs like shy returning exiles. People came out of their houses with shovels and seedlings. Retaining walls were rebuilt stronger. Ted from Lot 22 carved a new bench by the path and burned a single line into the wood with a branding iron. Water belongs to all of us. I never asked him to explain it. I didn't have to. By December, the lake wore a thin skin of ice along the edges, each dawn cracking into silver shards when the sun rose. The scars remained. Some foundations would always carry the memory of that summer. But the lawsuits settled quietly. The cracks were filled and the neighborhood learned to speak in softer voices. Karen's house sold in January. A moving van appeared on a gray Tuesday, and by nightfall, the windows were dark. No one waved goodbye. No one celebrated. We had all discovered that vengeance and justice are not the same thing. And justice, when it finally arrived, didn't roar. It whispered through the reeds. It rose in slow, patient inches. It hummed through an old pipe someone once tried to bury forever. I stayed through the winter testing flows, stocking minnows, planning a spring workshop for the high school environmental club. I don't know what I'll do when the cottonwoods turn green again. But I know this. They tried to stop the water with paperwork and pride. They thought intimidation could outlast patience. They thought power was louder than knowledge. They were wrong. I'm no hero. I'm just the man who refused to let the lake die. Because of that, the water is full again. And something inside all of us, something we almost forgot we had, is full again too. Peace. Or maybe just the steady, unbroken sound of water running free.